We will be centering our discussion, of course, language in higher education is on many people's minds at the moment for numerous obvious reasons. When examining these debates, one finds that in many cases, language in education is linked to issues of access, to issues of power, and one also finds in these debates repeated calls for the use of English, in many cases English only, in some cases to fight a perception of exclusionary language used in educational circumstances. And when considering this, we read a chapter by the late Neville Alexander on the issue of language in the modern South African university. And our idea is to structure this discussion loosely around some key points in this chapter. It seems to be, at the moment, that the assumption in many of these debates is that English teaching automatically results in greater access to education for all. Following from this, and considering our country's constitutional orientation and obligation towards multilingualism, I think that critical discussions such as this are becoming imperative and not just a luxury. So I think we might start off, Gerda, you can maybe give us a quote from the article that I've referenced, just to start off our discussion.
Yeah, Alexander says in this chapter, amongst other things, the use of English as a language of tuition at tertiary level, because of its lingua franca function among intellectuals and its global hegemony, is no guarantee of educational equity.
At the same time, one wants to say that surely English is the international language of knowledge creation and transmission, the language of international science. So why are we bothering having a discussion such as this? Why not only English everywhere? And I think, Professor Madiba, you can jump in at this point.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's already an afternoon. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And I really accept it because it has to do with some of the views, the ideals of Neville Alexander. I had an opportunity to work with Neville Alexander. We used to travel together to Central Africa, to Cameroon. You know, I would be talking all the time, and also had the opportunity to teach with him. So some of the debates, some of his views, which I still feel that Neville didn't get the opportunity to put down all his views. You know, when he told me that he was stepping down, I said to Neville, please, you have got so much when sitting listening to you, if you can really get all this thing done. And he said, look, when I retire now, I'm going to write my books, and unfortunately he didn't have the time to do that. But he always wanted people to debate with his views. Neville was one person that even in class, he didn't want students just to take his views. He would be very much happy when students engage with his views, reject them, argue with him, and then he would say that is where the solution is. It's only when we are in dialogue that we are able to come up with solutions. So unfortunately, that voice, we still feel that we miss that voice, that when you look at his stature and how he was willing to come down to engage with students, whoever, even university students, Neville will listen to them and he will submit, if he will admit if he was wrong, that they are right. So on the issue of English, I think this is one area that some people misunderstood Neville, that Neville is anti-English. And he made it very clear that he's not anti-English. His argument was that, yes, English first is a dominant language. At the moment, there's nothing that we can do. Statistics clearly shows how English is used, how English is widespread in publications. So he said that we cannot debate against. That is a fact. We need to accept it. But what we cannot accept is the hegemony of English. Hegemony of English is when English is replacing other languages. So that's what Neville said, no, we should not allow ourselves to do that. Because the dilemma is that if we allow English to replace our languages in which we've got high levels of proficiency, when it comes to education, we're going to have a problem. Because education requires a particular, learning in other language requires a certain level of a threshold level. Without having that threshold level, you will struggle to understand, you will struggle to learn. So he wrote a very nice article that has always quoted that English is unassailable, but it's unattainable. It's something that, yes, it's important, but the fact of the matter is that it's unattainable. it cannot be easily reappropriated in the way that we want to command it. But his argument was that we should not shed off our languages and replace them by English. So he said the argument was that it's not either or. It's not either English or other languages. Both are possible. And this is the argument that was supported by some of his friends, like Skednek Kangas, Philipsen, so Robert Philipsen. So all of them, I think overall globally, the argument is not really anti-English. The argument is now, how do we manage our linguistic resources? And English is one of those resources, but how do we manage those resources in such a way that we benefit from both? If it's Afrikaans, how do we use English in the way that it doesn't replace English? So I think in this country, not only in South Africa, but in other developing countries, what has been happening is the hegemony of English, where English has been replacing languages. In the continent of Africa, it's worse, because you see, even in everyday life, English is used even in a context where there is no one who speaks English. You will find people using English. They go to courts, find all people speak in African language, but all the proceedings are conducted in English. So I think that was his main argument. Let's not allow the hegemony of English.
Yeah, but if I may interrupt you there, if we look at universities in South Africa, we have quite a few, and there are universities where English is the only language of tuition. Isn't it working there sufficiently? Why should we look at other universities and we see, okay, they use English. Why then should we, Stellenbosch for example, why should we now worry about multilingualism if we see other universities just use English?
Because they seem, I mean, for all practical intents and purposes, they seem to be fine.
Yeah, well, I think it's good that you're asking that question from somebody who's coming from Rosemersfall University. Which is a predominantly English university. You know, I mean, UCT was known, I mean, it was established as an English university. And I think the assumption throughout was that whoever comes to UCT is able to study and learn in English. But I tell you, with the transformation, with the changes that we have now, I coordinate the university UCT language plan. What we have realized is that not all students are really proficient in English. But again, we, from the center where I come from, the Center for Education Development, again, we don't want to say that we need other languages because students are not able to speak English. Okay, that is a deficit model. No, but what our approach is that these students who are coming to UCT, whether they've got high proficiency in English or not, but these students who are multilingual, they are bringing linguistic resources to the university. And now how do you harness those linguistic resources which they bring in? But one thing that we know is that it is definitely some of the students cannot function or study in English only. So I don't know of really any, that's what Neville Alexander's argument, that if you check through, you will find only kids who are coming, very few kids who are coming from middle class families who come from this historic, those privileged schools or former Model C schools who will be able to compete. But if you look at, you see, the problem that we make is that we think of language use only in terms of communication as it happened in the class. So you must see this in terms of onion. And onion has got different circles. You can have right at the center, the main activity that we always focus on is what happened in the classroom. Yeah. You know, as I'm teaching, you are listening. So that is at that moment. But there are other study acts, there are other writing acts, there are other communication acts that are around that happen, where a student has to decide which language do I use when I do this. So students might be very good. We have students who are very proficient in class in terms of communication. If they're talking behind this wall, you can think this is a first English speaker. Mm-hmm. But if you get the students to write, then you begin to see the deficiencies, that the construction of text, the command of the arguments, you know, that is lacking. The proficiency, I mean, that's what Cummins always say, there's a difference between pigs and carps. So the basic interpersonal communication skills and the carp, which is cognitive academic language proficiency. So there is a difference when you have to think cognitively. You know, I've exposed it as UCT by starting a concept literacy project, because concepts requires not just surface understanding, and you really need to understand the dynamics of concept. So I started some tutorials where students will try to engage, and you'll see when we discuss concepts in English, students will just say this concept is, one sentence is done. Is that all? But when you give them opportunity, what do you think in your own language? You can see thinking in action. You can see how they construct their arguments. You can see how they move to and fro from their life experiences to what they engage with the concept, and then in the end they give something new. So I think that to me, English is not enough. That's my argument.
And that's what we discussed earlier when you said something about the difference between the language of teaching and the language of learning.
Yeah,
I found that quite interesting.
Yeah. You see, what language is it's a mediation tool. When you come to university, you're not just coming to be taught; you are coming to learn. And we've got various ways to learn. So I say
different things.
So university can. So even UCT, I said to them, look, you can prescribe the language of teaching in the class, but you will never prescribe the language of learning to the students, because you teach physics in English in the classroom, but just follow the students after they finish, after the class, and listen to what they're saying. While they speak in his cause, hey, what was he saying? They're not oot. The whole lecture is being downloaded in his cause, combined with English, moving to and fro. So you are prescribing only one particular area. So much of our struggle is focused on what happened in the classroom and of course on assessment. But there are other levels of interventions where we can allow students to draw from different levels. So I think if we were looking at, approaching language from a pedagogic point of view, I think definitely we need to promote an approach, multilingual approach. Multilingual, in this sense, my understanding of multilingual is not having parallel languages. I think psycholinguistic studies have shown us that although languages might come out of the surface level as different, but it's not what's happening. I've got one common storage where I produce different manifestation. So there's no box for balloon for English and a balloon for Afrikaans and a balloon for Xhosa. I speak 9 or 12 languages. Otherwise I would be having so many balloons in my head. But I've got one common storage. So as I'm talking now, I can draw from using the other surface manifestation when I get another. So students have got this rich storage of language. So there's no need to say if you don't study only in English, you're going to limit yourself having access to another language. You see, in the past they used to believe that because it's balloon, when you are pumping this one balloon, it becomes too big. So if you pump another balloon, so these balloons will become so big that the person will become mentally disturbed. There used to be such beliefs with bilingualism, but now those beliefs is clear. We can have as many languages as we can, as long as they're being supported. We can be able to use them as resources in the class.
New research on translanguaging also latch onto this idea that you don't really have, your brain don't have different languages. No. You have this rich resource of languages. So we should, if I'm understanding you correctly, we should strive toward creating students that are multilingual in themselves. And then when we talk about a multilingual university, we are in fact saying that we should have students that also embrace in themselves this multilingualism, this rich diversity of resources, language resources they have.
Yeah. So you see, it's true. Students bring those resources. What we've been doing was to neglect, to ignore those, to pretend as those resources are not there. Those students continue to use those resources. So when we are talking about multilingual universities, yes, we are saying we've got 11 official languages which are prescribed by the Constitution. Now, how do we function in that kind of a context? Does that mean that each university must have all 11 languages? So practically not. But I can tell you, in the more formal situation in the classroom, we might not be able to use all the languages. But in reality, in the real life outside, all these languages are functioning. Students are using them depending on who they are communicating to. So that's what the principle of functional multilingualism, which Neville speaks about here, that we prescribe to functional multilingualism, where you draw those resources that are relevant to that particular situation. Then you can draw them and use them.
I think following from that, perhaps we should touch upon the somewhat ideologically loaded term of the Afrikaans University. Neville says in his article, quote, the language of tuition does not determine whether or not a course or a university is racist or tribalist. It is what is taught that is decisive. Gerda, perhaps you want to react to that point, and then we can give Mbulu a chance to share his views.
Yes,
because is it that simple, firstly?
Yeah, that is the question. Is it that simple? Because if you consider the body of work on language and identity, you know, the link between language and identity, can we really say, you know, yeah, but okay, let's call a spade a spade. Stellenbosch isn't a racist university because the content of what we teach isn't racist. But what about perceptions? Alexander always said part of our identity is ascribed to us by others.
From outside.
From outside. So if the perception is indeed that because Afrikaans is taught at Stellenbosch University, that it is a racist university, an exclusionary university, yeah, what do we say about that? What if that is the perception that people have?
Yeah, you see, I think this is another level. You know, I think we need to see 3 levels in the institution. I always want to say there are different levels. There is a macro level, which is our high level, what decisions that are made by the management executive in terms of the language policy. So those are macro level. Then you've got the meso level. Meso level, these are decisions that are made, for example, in Afrikaans department, the decisions that are made in the middle level. So you can decide that this I want to teach in that particular course. So, but it doesn't apply that kind of a policy. It's applied across the university. But this is what that particular discipline, if it's course that they might decide that want to teach this course in this course. So these are decisions that are made at the mid level. But the micro level, in the classroom where I've got 5 or 10 students who speak maybe the language that I'm competent in, then I can still make decisions on that. But all decisions that you make, any language policy decision determines who will be able to participate, who will be included, who will be left out. So I think if we think at institutional level, the debate was that unlike English, because the majority of South African students, they are now studying through English. So there's no way that, although that historical English university can say we are excluding, unless maybe by just looking at the scores. But the majority of learners don't have access to, they're not really studying through Afrikaans. So that means if you adopt an Afrikaans only policy as an admission criterion, which is something, that's why I say micro level up there, then that policy will be excluding.
Absolutely.
That will be excluded. Yes, because you assume, of course, when you decide such a policy, you are assuming that any learning activity within your campus happens in Afrikaans, and that's not true.
Yes, exactly.
Because even the Afrikaans-speaking students who come to this university, I tell you, you can teach them through Afrikaans, but the moment they get to the library, they are pulling big volumes of English. They are reading through English, so they are moving between Afrikaans and English. So there's no one who is really learning through Afrikaans only.
Exactly.
But their ability for Afrikaans, for English, that ability sometimes is not assessed. As long as this is an Afrikaans university, as long as you can learn through Afrikaans, you can prove that you can learn. But the ability to learn through English, that is not assessed. So that's why Afrikaans is serving as a gatekeeper. So I think we need to look at that. So Neville used to separate this, that yes, institutionally. So to deal with the issue of practicality, how do you deal with multiplicity of languages? That's why he came to the issue of that. He mentioned this way where, in fact, that was 2006, before he read this article. I was presenting an article at a paper at a workshop when he asked, when we were trying to find models. So Neville Alexander proposed that he thinks that we should have a Zulu university. So I was sitting with one professor, Doug Young, and Doug Young looked at Neville and said, Neville, do you mean Zulu University? So Neville said, yes. What's wrong with the Zulu University? Because being Zulu University, it doesn't mean that it's inferior. It means, simply means that that university, predominantly, the majority of students who are there speak isiZulu. But it doesn't reflect on their curriculum. As long as the teaching is effective, it doesn't see any problem. So, of course, the same applies to Afrikaans. Can you have an Afrikaans university? Yes. But the problem that the moment you say you use a language, then you land into racial territories, where now you've got people who look the same, who speak the same language now, getting in. So that will be again the spirit of the university.
That's the interesting thing about Afrikaans, is of course Afrikaans has probably the most heterogeneous group of speakers.
Yeah.
They don't all look the same.
Yeah.
They don't all sound the same. And in and amongst themselves, they have numerous fights about these issues as well. But shouldn't we perhaps move away from the language of tuition as this kind of defining criteria? Because it's always interesting in public debates how you'll never see other universities, as long as they're not defined as Afrikaans universities, defined as an English university. They would be defined according to the research they do, or according to the publications they produce, or according to the students they send out into the real world. How do we get away from those kinds of perceptions, and how do we get back to the real work? Because I mean, we're actually here to study and to get qualifications. We're not here to be protectionists or to be archivers of some language, any given language. We are actually here to partake in a greater scientific global knowledge economy, for lack of a better term. So how do we balance those requirements?
You see, I think an ideal situation, you know, you see, when you deal with language blending, you have to deal with facts. I mean, there are realities. There's the real world. You know, if you look at the facts, where we come from, we come from a history where these institutions were established on the basis, of course, of language and the other ideologies and so on. So we are coming from that history. And that weight of history is very much with us. So the question is now, how do we move forward? So, and that is part of a transformation agenda, which Neville deals with it here. And Neville never, in his discussion, never recognize race as a reality. You know, he used to say to me, Mbulu, race is not real. Race is a social construct. Don't believe in race. It's not real. You know, racism is real, but race is a social construct. That thing doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
So that means now we're coming from a background where race was regarded as real. On the basis of race, institutions were established and so on and so on. So I think when we talk about transformation, the question is now, where do we want to go? Do we have a clear vision of that kind of institution that we want to get to? So what are we talking about there? Are we still saying, yes, it's reformed? Because Neville used to distinguish, say, no, most of the things that you are doing, you are just trying to reform. It's a reform agenda, reformative agenda. You are just reforming. It's not transformation.
Instead of transforming.
Yeah, you are reforming. You know, some of them are programs saying, what you are doing, these are reform programs. You are just trying to reform the institution. You should transform the institution. You know, transforming to him was saying, language to him is saying, if you can deal with language, it doesn't got nothing to do with the race. Language, if you use language, you will be able to transform the institution. So my vision of really the future university should be, this should not be universities that are described in terms of, that are neither English, that are neither Afrikaans, neither Zulu, neither Xhosa, but they should be South African universities. But they will differ in terms of their specialties, like you are saying, where you can say this is Stellenbosch University, but this is an identity. This is the focus of the university. UCT is not university for the English. I mean, that's why you see where we are now at UCT with people removing statues, and then you are also now busy removing the plaques. So, but that to me, it doesn't create. I think we need to go beyond those things. Those are symbolic things. But I think language is real. You know, how do we create the institutions where all our linguistic resources are recognized, and people come there are recognized as human beings studying their different disciplines, universities specializing in what it specializes on. So if we can get to that level where race does not matter, you know, in learning who comes in, you know, so the issue of language, like I'm saying, there are different models how we can deal with issue of language diversities and how we can harness that. But it should not be a long race.
But if we...
No, please go.
If we say we are not protecting a specific language at a university, aren't we kind of in danger to then just, okay, so everything is just English again? And we're back at square one saying, yeah, why bother then, you know?
But, I mean, in the same vein, I mean, the counter argument would be that we do have to take part in an international academic world. So how to interface that? I mean, how to use English plus, as Neville also called it, or additive bilingualism, or whatever term you want to ascribe to it, how to use and to nurture, let's use the word nurture for our indigenous languages, along with having a proper footing in the real academic world. Because I'm sure this is not only a South African tension.
No, it's a global problem. Yeah. You see, what Neville, Neville wanted to come up with practical solution. You know, he was not just, some people say Neville was idealistic. He was not idealistic. Neville will want to move beyond just idealism to a point where you come up with practical solution. For example, in this article, he focused much on African languages. So he said, how do you get these languages to be used? Because the reason why students are not able to use them is because maybe in terms of intellectualization, they are not well intellectualized. He gave an example of his friend, Professor Giorgio from Zimbabwe, who devised a program to teach chemistry, you know, in Shona. And that program, you know, it clearly shows how you can change the ontologies, the ways of changing the discipline, something that maybe we are demanding now, that we need to decolonize the curriculum. You know, bringing another way of thinking, another way of ordering knowledge, another way of understanding. So it's beyond just language and so on. So his view is that you don't just leave everything. They say, if you don't have, he used to say to me, if you don't have a plan, you don't have a plan, somebody's got a plan for you. So you must have a plan for your language. If you don't have a plan for your language, somebody's got a plan for your language. So if you don't have a plan for your language, the English speakers will have a plan for your language. So he said, we need to plan our language. And then he proposed different strategies. One, of course, was intellectualization process, that we really need to embark on serious intellectualization projects to develop African languages in different domains, so that, like the way other European languages emerged during the time of Latin, we need to do the same like that. And then the other project that he proposed was translation, that we need to embark into massive translations, that we translate ideas and then reconstruct knowledge in all our languages. And then if we do that, if there are sources, people will, because language policy means you have to choose. There must be alternatives. If there's only one alternative, you go to the library, there's only one book, there are only one language, books are in English, everything's in English, so there's no alternative there. But if we create alternatives, which I think Afrikaans has already done quite a lot in terms of material, things might not be really like before, but I think in terms of resources, Afrikaans has got a lot of resources. Which one, I mean, will feel that those resources need not be lost, because if that happens, that means the African speaking community, they will be where we are, the African languages are, and yet we want to get African languages to the level where they are functioning. You know, like what I mean, Afrikaans is one of the success stories that's ever happened in the continent. I know the circumstances were different, how Africa's got to where it is within a short span of time, but it's one of the success stories in terms of intellectualization, that you can take a language which was really a kitchen language and get it to the point where it is used to the house language. And some of us who are engaged with the intellectualization of African languages, we are drawing from those experiences. What can we learn from there, although the context is different? So I think the counter-hegemonic strategy against English, it is really not to sit and say, why bother? Is to say, we have these languages, we need to promote them, but in doing so, we don't do that in a more exclusive way. We need to be inclusive in whatever way we are promoting those languages, we are using them.
Getting our hands dirty, you know, if we say we as a university are really concerned with multilingualism, like you said, we make the resources available. Like you say, we give students the option of having alongside the English textbook the isiXhosa textbook, for example.
Well, at the very least, in almost constitutional term, I've wondered why can't a student just simply write their thesis in their language of choice and universities just fund the translation of such theses. I mean, if we have a body of literature indicating you're most comfortable in expressing yourself in your mother tongue, obviously there's practical implications, we all know this, but I mean, how do we draw, as you said, from the experience of Afrikaans having come to the point where it is, I mean, against a, let's call it a colorful background, how do we get the speakers of the language to want that and to want to claim that for themselves? Because I mean, the development of Afrikaans was part and parcel with a bigger nationalist project. That's not feasible at this point. How do we get the speakers to want that? I mean, I don't know how else to express it. Do you have any ideas for that? Because I always get a sense that we, all of us, I suppose, connect a certain prestige value to English. And that is counterproductive.
Yes, that is even true for the more and more for the Afrikaans community. Absolutely. I hear students from some faculty saying, no, I don't write my thesis in Afrikaans because it's supposed to be in English to be, out there. And I'm like, but haven't you heard about translation?
Yeah. And that's the beautiful irony. I teach third years in language planning and politics. My prescribed texts are almost exclusively English because we want to focus on the best and most recent research, as opposed to, as I said, being protectionist and prescribing the Afrikaans book just because there is one. How do we balance that out? How do we?
Yeah, you see, I think what we are struggling with, it's these monolingual assumptions that I've really mentioned. Yeah. That in education context, one must function in one language. And those assumptions are not based on reality. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Those assumptions are not based on reality. People function in different languages. It's only that those other resources are limited because of the context that we provide to students. For example, teaching, a lot of teaching in universities happens not only in the big class. We've got classes of 500 at UCE. One class is 500. But effective learning and teaching and discussion and debates, they occur on tutorials where you have got, the tutors and their tattlings, and if you see how they engage with each other there, using different language in those spaces. So there are many spaces of implementing multilingualism. Sometimes we think it should be one way, it should be one uniform. We make declarations. From today, this course is offered in this particular language. But this is against the reality. It's not how learning is going to take place. So I argued at UCT that, yes, our language policy, we just amended it slightly to be English plus. Then this plus, I say, it opens up spaces for innovation, where we should be able to innovate, where you should be able, whatever you find the spaces, the tutorial, if there are tutorials, allow those multilingual tutorials to take place. I recorded some of the tutorials where students were engaging with some of the concept. The VC had the opportunity to listen to them, and the registrar, they couldn't believe how students were engaging with concepts. They say, huh? Are these our students? I say, yes. And they were moving between Isxhosa, coming back, creating their own register, their way of understanding. And you can see at the end that these students have developed a deeper understanding. So I think what we're saying is that in as much as we cannot just say, okay, there is no language policy, there is no official language, there will still be language that we say, yes, the official medium of instruction, primary. We also coined the term, the primary medium. That means there are other media. So you open up the ideological and implementation space. So that allows whoever wants to come up with other innovation of teaching to come up with other framework. Because I don't think our solutions will come out from somewhere. South Africa is involved in a very unique situation where we have to find solutions. You go to Europe, you won't find
the models don't work.
The models don't work.
No.
You see, so our context it's very different. So we need to evolve solutions from among ourselves, and
from the bottom up.
From the bottom up, we might not get a solution that cut across, but a university should allow that space where people should be innovative, be creative, and come up with other solutions how learning and teaching can take place. Because all what we need is that when students come here, when they leave our institutions, they should be competent. It doesn't mean that they must live here with the best English they can. But when they leave here, the first thing that we want to have, they must be competent globally and locally. Yes. So that's what we want to build. So how do you do that? I think the multilingual approach, that could be the best way to do, and that's what Neville always promotes.
Yeah, that's what he said. He said it's not a case of no to English. It's not a case of either or. It's a case of both and.
Both and. Yeah.
He also has this beautiful quotation. He says that only by means of our own languages can we achieve, start quotation, the restoration of human dignity in Africa, this continent of slavery and so-called backwardness, and that we have to change radically the inherited linguistic habitus in terms of which English is the only feasible candidate for a language of high status. So it comes down to perception, and it comes down to matters of human dignity, apart from the practical issues of access and content and so forth.
Yeah, it is. Language is who we are. If you are using a tool that you cannot use it effectively, that undermines your dignity. I saw one interesting quote from University of Birmingham, which says, having English only, knowing to speak English only, is as good as knowing no English. So it's the same. If you only know English, you are as good as someone who does not know English, because you don't know the rest, and that other person doesn't know English, maybe knows other languages. So I think what is arguing is that we have impoverished ourselves by allowing ourselves to only go for this monolingual approach, adopt these monolingual approaches, and we, deny ourselves the linguistic richness that we have. But I think the way to go where we are, I don't see really somebody who know Afrikaans only to really have a future in this country. On that's gonna, it's a multilingual environment. Then we are operating in what we regard now super diverse, world. Super diverse. Wherever you go, you'll find this kind of diversity, this kind of English challenge. So I think the best way to go is to equip ourselves, to keep our students to have proficiencies in different languages, and also to allow the linguistic resources which we bring here to be used as part of learning and teaching.
Perhaps in conclusion, 2 short comments before we wrap up.
Thank you.
I should agree that much of what Neville wrote, of course, seems idealistic on the surface of it. I think we should emphasize the point that I don't think one can say Neville said that language planning only takes place bottom up. I think his whole point was that it should. I think that was a call for the way it should be done. I just feel I need to correct that point. Secondly, I think perhaps in the end and in closing, much of this still comes down to the actual human relations between actual people. In terms of people needing to trust one another, needing to trust one another's motives, and needing to create open spaces of dialogue such as this that should have started long ago, where we can engage with what is going on around us and with how we make each other feel by ways of acting. I think much of our acting as actors in this kind of university is could be seen as insensitive, could be seen as thoughtless, and I think it's important to bring these issues to the fore. At the same time, we have to keep the linguistic side of the argument in mind in simple practical terms. As Neville said, we should go for the English plus approach, perhaps. I think it is a minimum requirement of educational institutions in this country to find some sort of common language in which everybody who meets the qualifying criteria on academic merit is able to study in a language of which they have an understanding. I think there's much to be said about knowing some English versus knowing English fully. I do think that we can arrive at this point, as you said, drawing from the resources that we have existing around us, instead of expressing our anger, and our very understandable and comprehensible anger at the Afrikaans student being able to write their test in Afrikaans, and perhaps arriving at a point where we open dialogue about that, and where we discuss these issues, and where we try to add to what we have and not to take away just for the sake of taking away. I think it's better to, if you have an unequal situation, it's better to add to the side that don't have something than to take it away from the side who do. That does. Second language, sorry.